Hello, can you hear me? Hi. Hopefully I'm on live now. If someone can, I see the welcome in the chat. Thank you. That's very reassuring coming on Facebook Live alone. Um, I'm going to wait just a few seconds to get started, but it's really nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I want to make sure not to start too early so that people can gather. It's nice to, I see the warm messages. Thank you for them. And I'm thrilled to know that you can hear me, that technology is working for us. And as I say, I'll start I still have 10:29 East Coast time in the US, so I'll start in just 1 minute or so. I'm visible and audible. Great. Um, okay, is it fine if I get started? It looks like it is. Uh, I'm going to wait 1 more minute because I'm just seeing a notice here. So I'll wait 1 more minute. Um, and I see that I can tell that folks are still coming on. So I'll wait 1 more moment. Okay. Um, First of all, thank you so much for being here and for this invitation. I'm really honored. I want to thank Bolwan Takur and everyone who's part of organizing this amazing series. My name's Derek Goldman. Thanks for the kind introduction and for this invitation. You know, it's strange. I look forward. I believe that any discussion about a vision of theater is a conversation and not a monologue. So I look forward to the chance to answer questions and to connect with you. We're all gathered, in what are challenging times all over the world. And I hope, as you're listening to this, I hope this finds you well and healthy. I think in tumultuous times, which we are living in, our conversations about any conversation about a vision of theater and how theater matters shifts because, as we know, theater is alive. It is ever evolving. And as a living thing, living through times where our world is changing in such radical ways, it's a time where where it's a great opportunity to really think about how this art form is essential, how it matters. And so I'm really particularly honored to be part of a series where those big questions about theater are being asked on a global level and to be part of that conversation. I'll say a little bit about my understanding of the format for today. I'm going to share some thoughts with you for about 40 or 45 minutes this evening, about many of your time, this morning my time, and then we'll leave time for questions and conversation in the chat. So I'll talk longer than I'm used to talking without interruption, and I hope it's helpful and doesn't feel too much like a lecture. I'll just begin by locating myself briefly now, but then I'll go back and talk a little bit about my journey and how I got here, and then get to some ideas that I hope are useful to talk about around this question a vision for theater. I'm based in Washington, D.C., obviously a city that is a seat of a particular kind of power and also of symbolism here in the United States. I'm a theater maker, a director, and a playwright. I'm also run an academic department as chair of performing arts at Georgetown. But perhaps most directly relevant to our conversation, I also am co-founding director of an initiative called the Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics, based at Georgetown. Our mission is to harness the power of performance to humanize global politics, which sounds like a mouthful, but I hope by the end of our conversation, you'll have a better sense of some of what I mean by that. The lab, as we call it, I co-founded with my colleague, Ambassador Cynthia Schneider. She's not a theater person per se, but is a diplomat who was ambassador to the Netherlands under President Clinton and teaches courses in culture and diplomacy. I think why I start with this, one of the things that's interesting about being in Washington, D.C., doing this work and being at Georgetown, which is most famous, although it has many strengths, it's most famous for its School of Foreign Service and its work in international relations. And the lab is the one joint initiative between our college, which contains performing arts, and the School of International Relations. So what this means is that we're working with and training not only artists, but also future diplomats and policymakers and people who will work in the State Department. And what's really inspiring about this is we're able to engage the questions we all as theater makers are asking about story and narrative and how it matters. And not only have those policymakers be thinking about politics from the sense of pieces on a chessboard or strategy, but really to kind of understand the arts. And one of the most exciting things we get to do is bring students together who are on the artistic side and who are on the foreign service or international relations side. And what happens that's really beautiful to witness is that the artists start to think about their work in terms of how it matters in the world, in terms of a larger context than just let's make a play. They see the impact and they see the cultural resonances and the global resonances, and the people who may not think of themselves as artists who want to go on in other fields and to be at the table when policy decisions are being made start to imagine themselves as creative beings and to see that that itself is an art form and to be inspired by the theater people. So the lab, that's one of the exciting things about the lab. We're here in Washington, D.C., which is a world-class theater city. We are engaging with issues that are critical issues in the world, whether those are issues of migration, of climate crisis, of racial justice, which is, of course, a major issue in our country. We produce festivals, we develop new work. We have an amazing global fellows program with young artists from around the world. We offer courses, and above all, we build relationships and networks to try to bring people together from around the world, which is very much the spirit of this conversation. And that's, I think, what I kind of love most. So that's a little bit about what I'm doing now and what the lab is and kind of how I'm sitting here as I speak to you and what excites me. And I'll rewind backwards and just tell you briefly a little bit of a personal story of some pieces of how I got here, and then offer some vision thoughts such as they are. And of course, it's not a linear story. I think most of us have stories that are how we arrive where we are is usually not a straight path. But a very formative moment for me was in high school in a town called Brookline, Massachusetts, when I was about 15 years old. I was very fortunate to stumble upon something that high school offered called the Brookline Educational Theater Company. And what was happening in this theater company were high school kids, like myself, 15-year-old kids, were working with a professional theater maker and community members to develop new plays around social issues that mattered in the community. So we developed plays about freedom of expression and freedom of speech and why that was important, about drug and alcohol abuse, which was an issue and remained an issue at the high school. And we would, create these plays and then present them to the community and sometimes tour them within the community. I think this changed my life because what was very radical and stayed with me was the sense right from the beginning that theater was not just entertainment and was not just a way to play, although I was interested in that. Many high schools in America just put on musicals or plays that are just designed to give the students an experience. But we were really engaging with very challenging issues, and the process of making the play was forcing us to reckon with those issues. And then the play itself would create a conversation that deepened the community sense of those issues. And I think importantly, that process, we were working out of our zone of just a group of 15-year-olds. We were working with adults from the community. So it was also an exercise in bringing together different kinds of worldviews. And so this was very exciting to me, and I feel very lucky that I came to understand pretty early in my life that theater could do that it could speak to critical societal issues. Many of my American colleagues don't find that out until much later. So I learned that early, and it steered me towards a particular university, Northwestern University, which is located outside of Chicago in Evanston, Illinois. And why I was excited to go there is not only was it a world-class theater school where I could learn more about acting and directing and playwriting and those kinds of things, but they had a performance studies program with theater that was where I didn't have to choose. And what that meant was that not only could I learn how to do theater well, but I could engage with performance as a methodology, as a practice, and as a way of understanding the world. So one way of saying this is looking at not only developing the skills to do it well, but understanding how it matters in the world and trying to have a global perspective about that. So again, I felt very lucky as an 18-year-old to be having those conversations and to be, in a sense, inheriting different traditions around how performance matters in the world. The other thing that Northwestern was famous for, particularly then, was the practice of adaptation, taking texts that were not created as plays, not theatrical texts. So these might be novels or historical materials or memoirs or material from the archive, and turning it into theatrical to plays. And this is a practice that, of course, is done in different ways all over the world. But this also was very informative to me, is to start to think about the entire world as a potential source for performance. And so I really embraced the fact that I got to think about historical archives, that I got to think about protest material or speeches or other things as ways that theater could be made, in addition to coming to appreciate the Greeks and Shakespeare and great, American playwrights like Tennessee Williams and Chekhov and African-American playwrights. So there is a body of dramatic literature, but a whole other body of material. And for all of my life, I've continued to create plays that are taken from and adapted from many, many sources. During that experience in college, in Chicago. So this was like 1988 to 1992. We in America were living through the AIDS epidemic, as people were in different ways around the world. And it was killing many young people in our country, and disproportionately it was killing many artists who were part of the communities that were making theater. And so this very deeply informed my experience of college, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately because now I'm teaching university students who are themselves living through a pandemic and having their experience of college completely transformed. Not that it's the same thing as the AIDS epidemic, but by those events. This was very personal to me because an uncle who was very close to me that passed away, died of AIDS, during my experience in college. And at that time, a group of us, all of whom had been personally impacted by AIDS, came together after this death and created a work of theater called Behind the Front, a response to the ongoing AIDS epidemic. This was before there had been much theater or film about AIDS. The famous American play Angels in America had not been written or premiered yet. So it was quite early in terms of trying to reckon with and tell a meaningful story about AIDS. And, you know, in a sense, we didn't really know that much what we were doing. It was very intuitive. We were 20. We had had a intense life experience around all of the people involved in the project. Were deeply invested in the material, and we made something that wove together a range of materials, and it struck a very intense nerve in the community, both at Northwestern, and then it was invited to tour around, and we got to perform it for different kinds of audiences that were suffering from the disease, community activists, and others. This was very healing and very powerful to see that my own personal loss and pain and something that was happening in the wider world that was overwhelming, that a small number of us could come together and say something and make something that could speak back into that pain. That led directly, that experience, to the founding of a theater company in Chicago that I founded called Street Signs. And really that kind of work was its mission, to do what we thought was, you know, top-notch artistic professional theater, but that was engaging with critical and essential issues in our world and was engaging communities in those conversations. We worked in housing projects, we worked in all kinds of spaces. So that work in Chicago in my 20s was very important. I stayed running the theater company, but also pursued a doctorate at Northwestern. And I'll just share briefly that my dissertation project, my PhD project, I've been thinking about it a lot lately, was around what I called the politics and poetics of adaptation. And specifically, I was staging, directing, and adapting a large-scale African-American novel called Divine Days, and working closely with its author, who was dying of cancer and who was chair of African-American studies at the time. And so this was a very large, complicated process. And my interest was that the artistic practice, the thing we were doing that was of making the play, making the art, was also simultaneously and inseparably a political process, a process of the negotiation of identity, power, representation. All of that was mixed together. And so the dissertation basically talks about critical race studies and a whole range of other things, but really about adaptation, not just as an art form, but as a kind of way of being in the world, as a social practice. And I used this very complicated year in my life developing this project as what we would call an ethnographic field site. It was, you know, we were looking at it and talking to dozens of people who were part of that process as part of it. So that was very formative work for me. part of why I think about that work all the time is that right now in the United States, we are, as I'm sure many of you know, going through some very important reckonings around social and racial justice, the Black Lives Matter movement. And these, of course, manifest in all kinds of ways in terms of questions around relationships with the police and law and order. But they manifest very profoundly in the space of culture and in the space of arts. The question of whose stories get told and by whom, issues of power, issues of appropriation, and the theater's also going through long-term questions about who's controlled the funds, who has managed these spaces, and how have those been distributed, who has been invited to the table. And so one of the things that I feel privileged is to be able to be kind of part of those conversations. I'm on the board of an organization called Theater Communications Group, which is the TCG. It's the large umbrella organization for the kind of professional regional nonprofit theater in America, not Broadway, but the national network of theaters. And what this means is I get to be in the room with leaders who are really thinking deeply about how things have been for decades, what's been broken, and how to change that. And a lot of those questions are about justice, actually, and about power and who gets to tell their stories and how. So I've now been in Washington, D.C. and at Georgetown for just over 15 years. To say a little bit about Washington, I feel that it's a place where we have tended to have what I think of as temples of culture and temples of politics. If you come to Washington, there are many very beautiful, specific-looking buildings, and some of them, like the Kennedy Center, which is our National Center for the Arts, house arts events, or the Folger Shakespeare Library, and others of them are temples of politics, where our congressmen and our leaders spend their days, and some of those same people then spend their nights in the temples of culture. One of the ways of thinking about our work with the Lab for Global Performance and Politics is trying to bridge that gap, to really look at, and this is not just about the content, not only plays about politics, but questions of like how stories are told, where they're presented, who has access to them, how much money does it cost to attend, who feels welcomed, who's allowed to do the telling. These kinds of questions are the questions the Lab takes up and that I think have come to the center more broadly in American theater practice. We're not just making art in a vacuum. We're really reckoning with how art and artistic practice is engaged with all of these other spheres of our society. One of the things about the pandemic, I think, is that it's exposed a lot of things that have been broken for a long time beforehand. And this is not to make light. This is a very painful, very hard time for our artists who are out of work. The theaters are closed. And, you know, our industry, such as it is really stalled right now. But I think something that a lot of people are finding hope in is that it may lead, it's also forcing these kind of really deep conversations that may lead to some long overdue changes. One trend in the United States has been that we've invested more in buildings than we have in artists themselves. We have these amazing buildings in most major cities in America, privately funded by wealthy, well-intended, for the most part, donors and patrons. But the artists do not make a living wage or barely make a living wage, the people who are doing the work in those buildings. And so I think sometimes culture has been a space where separations of power and elite status is maintained more than a space of real reckoning and coming together. And so that's something that may be shifting. So that's some backdrop, and I'll say a little bit now about, you can probably get a sense of some vision things in what I'm sharing, but I'll offer a few other things in the spirit of really think of these as provocations, questions for you, more than me stating a vision, because that's not quite how I think. I think it's interesting to note that I think theatrical performance is one of the aspects of human experience in some ways that's changed the least over millennia. Obviously, there are certain things that have changed, the use of technology, the fact that we have lighting design in some of our buildings and multimedia possibilities. But if you think about all the changes in how we just communicate or travel or consume, the basic act of gathering together in theatrical space, breathing the same air as other human beings to witness and be part of a story is thousands of years old and hasn't really changed. We can still do that in much the same way that we did thousands of years ago. And we, as humans, we are drawn to doing it. So I think it's interesting to ask the question, especially in hard times, what does theater do well? And why do we need it? What are we getting from it? We have so many ways now of consuming and creating stories and sharing them. We have TikTok and YouTube and Netflix. And so what are we looking for from theater? And here is a sort of list that I've rehearsed over time, but of some of the things that I think we might be looking for. Are we seeking a space to give meaning to our struggles? Are we seeking to gather in community, to be near other human beings, to be less alone, to take refuge, to practice empathy, to connect to the unknowable or the mythic or the spiritual, to experience the release or catharsis that laughter provides, or tears or other kinds of emotion. But I'm particularly interested actually in laughter, which we understand. Comedy is very important. The sort of social function of comedy, the need to laugh. We know that laughter actually physically releases endorphins and makes us healthier, makes us live longer. That's I've been told by my medical colleagues that's scientifically true. To better understand the past, to better understand ourselves, to better understand one another, to better understand what we are up against now, to have our numbness pierced, our sense of habit pierced, to grieve what we have lost, to wrestle with and make visible some of the most taboo or silenced or challenging aspects of our world. I saw an amazing piece that Yael Farber, my colleague, created that was at Edinburgh and toured called Nirbhaya, that dealt with the gang rape in New Delhi some years ago, and sort of through interviews was really, the piece was performed by the people whose story it was, who had had the personal experience. So that's a case where something that had been silenced and taboo was made visible, I think, through performance to be wrestled with. To equip ourselves with tools to navigate or to transform our worlds, or to imagine or to rehearse the future. There's many other things that it might do, but I think this is, I'm constantly with my students and with colleagues trying to sort of return to the question of, like, why are we doing this? What is the need? And I think at a time where many of us can't do what we did, which is gather in the theater because of the pandemic, it's an interesting time to be reckoning with those questions and coming up with our own answers. One idea that has animated my work for a long time that I like, and some of you may have heard, but is the idea that theater should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. I think this is really deep and important, that for those who are afflicted, that those who are in pain, the theater can become a space to say, oh, I'm not alone. This is actually something other human beings, that I can bring it into community and into a sense even of history. Other human beings have suffered and reckoned and grappled with these same questions, and I can feel less alone through that artistic experience. My affliction can be comforted through that communal experience. But similarly, it's a space to afflict the comfortable. And I think, that's a really, we say that we do that, but I think at least in our tradition here, theater is to a large degree a very comfortable practice. We have these beautiful buildings with plush seats that are expensive to go to, that people go into and have an experience in which the lights go down on them for the most part, and they witness and experience a story or a world, and then are kind of restored to themselves at the end. That's the kind of Western bourgeois theater tradition, and it has many, many buildings, these temples of culture that hold it up. And I think this idea of afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted, and theater being a kind of equalizing space and a space of encounter for people to really look deeply at the experiences of people who are different than them, not just those who are like the people they would meet in their daily rounds every day. That is really so much at the core of what I think the power of theater has always been, but is maybe even more deeply now. We in the United States, and I know certainly in other parts of the world as well, but we live in a incredibly polarizing country. We really have, many would say, two countries in a sense right now. There's an enormous amount of distrust, animosity. It's fueled by the worlds of social media and, the sort of sense of misunderstanding, sense of incredible distrust, even about what essential core truths are. Are there facts on which we can agree? Are we living in the same world? And so if this fosters much hatred, resentment, and distrust, I'm very interested in theater's power it's never going to solve that, but to be a constructive part of a solution to that worsening problem. And of course, it's not just a national problem in the United States. All over the world, we have more forced migrants in the world than at any other time in human history. People who basically are unwelcomed. They are dehumanized by being told, you aren't welcome here, you don't have a home. And so this is a global challenge, and I think theater has something to bring to it. I've been honored to witness work that colleagues of mine in Bangladesh are doing in Rohingya camps with theater, using theater as a tool. But even at a small level, I'm involved with a practice that I call Performing One Another, and a program called In Your Shoes, which basically takes the oldest idea in Western theater, which was Aeschylus's idea from 2,500 years ago when he wrote The Persians, that the audience should be able to empathize with the enemy and see the enemy as human beings. And this, in the context of war, was a very radical idea, to go to the theater and have the people you're fighting against in war be like, oh, they have stories also. That's a mother with a child. That's a soldier with, to humanize those stories. So this work that we do called In Your Shoes, we've just been working with, I've been doing versions of it all over the world, but the basic idea is to bring people together through dialogue. We do some group call and response work, which is really about things as simple as stating one's full name in a circle, a space of trust, hopefully gain trust, and having everybody hear back and speak back to the person that full name. Lays a foundation. But what happens, I find, especially when I do this in international or global groups, is just that experience of somebody sharing their name and then hearing it back, because many people haven't heard their name. They've made their name more polite to sort of, more understandable. People will burst into tears the first time around the circle, just from the sense of recognition. And then there's other work that we do. People conjure in a place of importance to them, and we just repeat that back. Or the name of someone who's absent, and and we say, so I would say, I mentioned my uncle who died of AIDS. I would say, my uncle, Chas Goldman. And everyone would repeat, Chas Goldman. I don't tell a story about him, actually, but suddenly conjured into this shared space are some shared references or experiences. And then a next part of that work is that people in pairs have conversations with each other, just not an interview, just a conversation around a prompt like, let's talk about what home means to us, or let's talk about faith or belonging. And those conversations get recorded, and then the individual chooses a section of the other person's words to create as a performance and bring back to the group. And the pair comes back together and they perform one another's words, and they also pay attention to how the spirit of the person, the essence of the person sharing it. And it's really very simple work in a way, but I have found it just so powerful and transformative to my practice. And I've been doing workshops. I do it with not only theater students, but with medical students, with elderly populations. And I find that it offers something that people find very, very deeply potent, because it gives them a kind of opportunity to listen deeply with respect to other voices, and also to see themselves through someone else's eyes in ways that we often don't get to. So that work is a practice, but it also is reflective of a vision, I would say, that I have of, what it means to step into the shoes of others. And we often do this with communities who are not seeing eye to eye politically. So we work with, for example, Georgetown students and a conservative Christian college called Patrick Henry College. And we bring those students together who are for the most part, have very different life experiences, very different ideologies, very different politics. But they meet as human beings in a creative, collaborative process, and they come to find some foundation of respect. And I think theater in lots of forms can do that. I'm conscious of the time, so I'll just share a few other ideas, and then we'll open it up to questions. I mentioned the sort of bourgeois theater apparatus and the fourth wall and the lights and the cushy seats. So I've been very influenced by Brecht and the many others. Brecht gets a lot of credit for a lot of things that a lot of other people also did, but the notion of the epic theater, and then Boal extending that to the notion of the spectator, the idea that witnessing as an audience member can actually be more than just a passive activity. The artists did a play and I listened and watched and regarded, but that I might have a different role to play, either literally within the event in a kind of participatory way, and we're seeing more theater that does that. And of course, in many cultural traditions, that's not new, that's old. But for Americans, it's newer. I think we've had a habit of sitting politely in the theater and watching things. And now we're seeing more participatory forms, and by implication, I think the sense that to witness is an important action that might carry with it responsibilities around next steps. There's a project that I've been working on that I hope some of you will get to see, because we've just made a film of it, really largely occasioned by the fact that the production was supposed to tour internationally and then had to be postponed because of the pandemic. But we were fortunate to have a film producer who was excited about the production, and we got together and have made a film that will be released this fall. It's about a Polish World War II witness to the European Holocaust, Jan Karski, who was a professor at Georgetown for many years. And he's played by the famous American actor David Strathairn, who's a Hollywood Academy Award nominated actor. Why I mention this project is what makes me passionate about this story is not just, it's an interesting story from history, but is its relevance to young people today, to the current moment, because it's a story about witnessing, active witnessing, individual responsibility, the question of what one can do for the world. That was Karski's question as a teacher, as in his actions. That's the question that haunted him throughout his life. And so that, for me, making a theater piece that's not just artistically compelling, but that has a social purpose that we hope it will have, that people will have to reckon with and grapple with. I think one of the things that I think is true in the United States, and I think is true in many parts of the world, and I'll be interested what you think of it, but we talk a lot about it at the lab, is that artists matter and have an enormous amount to offer, but they're also devalued in many different ways and cases, and in many cases artists devalue themselves. I think repressive governments around the world and extremists have understood often far better than artists themselves the power that culture and the arts have, which is why they effectively silence those voices. You see it across history time and time again in the world. People who want to control power, the place they start is let's silence the artists. But ironically, I think often we as artists don't understand the potential power we have, why we have a habit, again, at least in the United States, to want to be left alone to do our art, to sort of we exist over here and all that other stuff is over there. And I think part of what the lab has had an opportunity to try to do in Washington, D.C. is bring artists to the table in a different ways around these conversations about migration and immigration, labor, climate issues, racial justice, and the legacy of slavery in America, which is a huge topic in the country, but also on our particular campus. When we founded the lab about 8 years ago, I think we thought that artists would get it, and that the others, the people on the kind of international relations side, would kind of eventually get it, but wouldn't understand its power. And the irony, I think, has been, in some ways, the inverse has been true, that it was very much faster than we expected for people in government circles and in other fields, the sciences, medicine, to say, oh, this is what the arts can do. This gives us a story. This gives us a human way into this otherwise intractable problem. It gets people talking. And of course, not all art does that equally, but good art that works can do that. Whereas the artists, I think, sometimes have had a hard time coming through the door, even if the door is open, to say, I belong at this table and I have something to say about these critical issues in our world. Maybe they have something to say over here in the theater, but to actually get that out. So that's something that I think is a challenge that we face. I think I'll close by just saying that and this is really opening it out to all of you, that the biggest thing for me in this work, it's really been about a little more than 10 years since I kind of, in a way, started to luck into the incredible life-changing experiences I've had doing cultural exchange work. And I've become vice president of International Theater Institute and been part of a whole range of networks and made amazing friends around the world who are brothers and sisters in this tribe of theater making. And I think it's always beautiful and ironic to me that people who live next door to me in my neighborhood, I might have less in common with and a harder time connecting with than someone halfway around the world who we share this art form. And I think that the power of those exchanges, and this is one of them, really what the lab is at its core is about a network. We have these amazing global fellows from all over the world who are path-breaking artists. And a lot of my work has shifted from just making theater to trying to help create platforms for amazing artists who are working in Palestine, Cambodia, Lebanon, Zimbabwe, Colombia. They're, and working under really challenging odds and trying to create relationships and networks so they feel less alone and so they can connect with artists who are doing not the same work, but can be part of a kind of extended global family. That's what I think theater allows. At its core, it's about breath and people in a space and relationships. We're finding ways through Facebook Live and Zoom to create some virtual versions of those. Those are great tools. We also, most of us, want to be back in live theater spaces making them. But part of why I was so moved to be asked to do a talk like this, and always am when I am, is that it holds in it the promise of more of these relationships, people who have a shared interest who I otherwise wouldn't connect with. And I think that's for me a big core and part of what theater provides. So I think because I've been watching the the ticker, and we're in good time. But I do, there were many other things I was potentially going to bring up that I could talk about in terms of specific projects. But I think hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of some ideas about vision, some ideas about some of the things going on in the United States, and a little bit of kind of my story, such as it is on this particular Wednesday. So if people have questions, I'm open to them, and I'm going to try to see them in the chat. And I'm scrolling down, I guess. Great, I see a few here. Terrific, thank you. I'll start with this question. Are theater people working to explore new alternative spaces other than the existing infrastructure? And I assume that is a question largely about the United States. The short answer is yes, absolutely. And I think there's always been an ecosystem where there's a kind of establishment, and then there are these alternative voices and alternative spaces. And there are many extraordinary examples in the United States of experimental or underground, more underground kind of theater work that has always, it's happened. Of course, it relates to geography and real estate, what kinds of spaces people can find. But it is happening. I think, that's often where the most important and exciting and envelope pushing work is. I think it, I think one of the challenges sometimes, I guess one of the things I would say is I think we have a habit of what we call kind of ghettoizing work because of its venue. And so some of what I was talking about with these fancy buildings, it's my belief that we see you go to the Kennedy Center and you see some artistic work that is absolutely essential and critical and speaking to people in all the right kinds of ways, and some work that's completely exploitative and, and I'm not saying I'm the arbiter of those things, but just in terms of the quality of work that happens. And you go to an underground theater or a high school auditorium or a refugee camp, and you also can see work that is of the highest artistic caliber, truly, that is earth-shattering. Or you might see work that just is derivative and, problematic. And I think we have too much of a hierarchy. And I think that a lot of my interest is in how to kind of bring communities together that might otherwise exist in these silos. But there's absolutely exciting work happening in experimental spaces. I'll take Partho's question. Do we go to perform theater in village areas of America? And share some of that experience. I think the one of the dynamics in this polarization that I was describing in America of feeling like it's two countries, one way that manifests is there's a very big, what we call an urban-rural divide. We have these cities like New York and Washington, and that are elite cities that have amazing cultural buildings and lots of money going to support the arts, and people, they're magnets for culture. And then we have regions across the country, is very large, across the country where the arts thrive in the city. But I think the work in what you're calling the villages and in rural spaces, of course it happens. People make art and they're making amazing art. But that work sometimes doesn't come on the radar. So the short answer is yes, we do go to perform or witness performances in those spaces. But I actually feel like a lot of my job is to try to just be aware of that ecosystem and amplify it. So I have colleagues who are doing amazing work in rural communities, and they're in networks and organizations doing that. And we work to make sure that work isn't made invisible. And I think that's some of the work of building understanding and trust across. I'm going to take this question about the latest techniques in film and television has dominated the content. Great question. And how will theater survive? Yeah. So I think you're asking about the media and film and television and all of the technical innovation that we have, and then of course the virtual world, and how will theater survive? I think for me the answer gets back to those essential questions I was asking. I don't have the answer for how that will be true in India, and I really don't have it for how it will be true in the United States. But I think there is something in those questions about what is essential about coming together and breathing the same air and doing this thing that can never be answered by Zoom or Facebook Live, even as we find innovative theatrical ways to use these technologies. And people are doing that. I have colleagues who are using Zoom right now to make what I consider actually really surprisingly good theater. They've got ways that they're getting people out of their boxes and using layers and composition, and stage managers are running cues live. So I think it's healthy that we're learning new forms, but they can't replace. I think that the trick will be, when we can be back in theaters, is not just going back to the way it was, but how to integrate new ideas and then also return to the kind of essential things, the question of what we can do only here and why this matters so much. And that's different depending on where you are. And I think one of the things in the United States there's been complacency about that. It's like, oh, we have a theater. It has an $8 million budget. It has a 6-play subscription season, and people come in. But the sort of essential question of who is this serving? Why does this matter? How is this keeping the art form alive? Is not always the front burner question. You can take that for granted. Whereas my colleagues in Belarus, who run the Belarus Free Theater, who had to create their plays basically in hiding from the repressive government and send messages on text audience, the play is going to happen here tonight, because there the need for the art was so essential. It was like food. It couldn't be taken for granted. So I think some of this is going to be about what we don't take for granted. I hope that makes sense. Sorry that this is a challenging thing to monitor my own questions, so I hope I'm getting to your questions. Can you see my question 2 steps before? I'm looking for your question, Subodh. I don't see it 2 steps before, so I apologize for that. Maybe put it in the chat again, and I'll circle back to it. But thank you, Ayash, for that great question about film. And, I will also say that I'm just made a film and had a great time, but it was a film of a theater production. So part of what was interesting for me was learning. I've done some work in film, but sort of having the experience of bringing my theatrical vocabulary to new technologies and skills. And I think that's an exciting thing to do. It doesn't have to be either or. They don't have to compete necessarily. I'm not sure I'm seeing another question here, but I'm scrolling down. I see lots of warm comments, so I thank you for those. If anyone has another question, feel free to put it in the chat. And if there's one I missed, feel free to paste it and put it in the chat again. Talk about the craft and preparation work when you collaborate with actors from different school systems of beliefs. That's a great question. Thank you, Sunil, for that question. I think one of the biggest things I'll say is I actually think it's one of the most exciting things that can happen when you get in a room. And people work differently. Of course, it creates some challenges because people we have to learn how each other work, and it takes respect and an environment where everybody is willing to kind of, defer some of the power in a way of saying, well, I work this way and I know it's the right way. That's a safe space to be, and be in the more vulnerable space of being open to different ways of working. And then also being able to offer, it's like what we call step up, step back, not just, oh, we'll work your way, but saying, oh, I have this thing to bring to the table, and now I'm going to use my kind of emotional energy to share it with a new group of people, to sort of carry and pass it on that way. But I believe, one example I have for this is our Global Fellows program and the work, which we're now is in its second cohort. But those cohorts that we've brought together are certainly examples of people from totally different parts of the world and totally different understandings of how performance is made. And yet, because they sort of bonded in spirit as artists with a shared vision who loved and trusted each other, the process of watching them share those skills and tools was really, really beautiful. So I think that I don't think you can rush that process, Sunil, in terms of bringing people together. But in some ways, I think it's a little bit analogous to bringing people together with different worldviews to have a conversation. It is hard because people start in a place that's just like, I just don't see how you could be a respectable human being and believe what you believe. That's how we have that when we bring our students together, and it's like, your belief violates my humanity. So where do we begin to respect each other given that? That's the feeling. So that's even more intense. But the way is that some of these methodologies and practices can kind of open up spaces of humanizing and trusting and building respect. But I don't think you can rush that. And I think there are tools, I think I also think breaking down hierarchies, and some of these are ingrained in self, the idea that like, you need to have gone to some elite conservatory to get trained a certain way in order to be a legitimate artist. It's just not true. And in fact, sometimes those places do more harm than good because they provide an idea that ends up being a kind of cordoned off or elite idea about this is the one way to do practice. And certainly, so I think that kind of openness and maintaining that openness is really important. I hope that offers something. Subodh, how do you differentiate theater for mass and theater for class? I'm not sure I'm confident. As you said, more because when theater goes to people, the whole process defers. When you expect people to come to theater in Indian context. I see. I think I understand more what you're saying. I see what you're saying. I think you're talking about, it's a great question, about kind of the tension between what we sometimes think of as quote unquote, and I don't like the term, sort of high art for the elite who are patrons of the arts, and for people who don't think of themselves as patrons of the arts and like what theater has to offer them. This is a huge question, a huge challenge. I think as you probably sense from my talk, I think the more we can do, and it's probably very culturally specific how we do it, to break down those differences, to find ways that everyday people have, and I mean that broad, the people who don't think of them as the arts as something that matters in their lives, have access to the experience in a way that is meaningful to them. I feel like if you just bring them, and it feels like medicine, and you say, this is art, it's good for you, it's high art, it's classy, it's alienating. We have that happen a lot in the American theater where, young people are brought to see a play that doesn't speak to their experience. In some ways, it feels like it negates their experience. It can feel almost a little violent. It's like, who are these privileged people? Like, their experience isn't my experience. And do they even know I exist? Because I'm sitting here in the theater with them, but I'm not comfortable. So you can actually do harm, I think, in those situations. But I think trying to cultivate spaces of encounter that are like spaces that are welcome spaces where art belongs, that cut across those is very important. Because if art is just for a few, it will never, it's just not it's not true to what we all know theater's power is. If it's just an elite privileged activity, it really is operating at such a tiny fraction of its potency. And it goes both ways. I think that it takes time and work, and then this has to be supported. I think we've had in our country a distrust of work that's just for sort of, it's seen as instrumentalizing. What we mean by that is, oh, that's work that's, well, doing good stuff for the world, but it's not real art. And I've often said that I think we have to stop trying to make this false distinction between art that is good and art that does good for the world, because any art that is good needs to be doing good. And if it's just like, well, that's a beautiful play, but it has no impact, then I have questions about it. And it doesn't mean that just because a piece of art is taking on an important social issue that it's doing good. It might not be. And in many cases, I think that's a question. So we have to have high values and standards for both art's power to be good. And I don't think we can put any one person's evaluation on that, and to do good. And I think that speaks to your question about theater for mass and theater for class. Arjun, my friend and former student who I love, are a lot of the most compelling stories that resonate in different contexts and cultures designed to appeal to a wide global taste, or are they often very culturally specific? Great question. I think we have a lot of both, and I think they both have value. I mean, I don't think you can hierarchicalize one being, one of the things about the theater is it both traffics in the intimately local and in the global at the same time. Those are, but I think that doesn't mean that every project, there is sometimes a problem when we don't know what the thing is, or we have false expectations that the local will translate to the global. But sometimes there are these beautiful surprises when it does. People say, this story is about, a Jewish girl in Holland in World War II. How is it possible that it applies so deeply to my experience 75 years later in a totally different part of the world? And that's a moment where the local and global can connect. But I think we need both. I think we need stories and projects that bring people together across and speak to shared experience, and that's their point, that we find the common ground. And then I think theater has enormous power to stay deeply local and to engage with issues that are very specific to one village, to one place, to one community. And then it might turn out that that has resonance somewhere else, but that might not be the purpose of the project. And I think that's okay. All right, I'm going to take one or two more. Sunil, again, thank you. What do you think actors all over the world are missing these days? You can see the world is not producing as many great actors as before. Is it distraction of social media and practicing fake personality to get attention? Could very well be some of that. I think, I don't know, even though I get to do this work around the world, I sometimes am not sure that it's necessarily true that we don't have as many great actors. I don't know, but I think how we define that is complicated, And I think, one of the things I see a lot is amazing, amazing actors and artists who aren't famous and who aren't doing the work to get recognition or to be regarded as great. That's not their mission or their purpose, but they are great. They are master craftsmen. They do this work with such rigor and craft and deep abiding sense of the meaning and purpose of the work all over the world. And I feel privileged, even at global festivals around the world, you can sort of walk in space and say, I don't understand this piece. It's in another language. This form is new to me. But that artist is a master and is so committed to this experience, and that can be beautiful sleep. And that might be someone who is not on our radar. So I think it may be that what greatness is and how we reward it is shifting because of the distractions that you're naming and some of the social media fake personality stuff. But there are great actors, even in the United States, who don't work much, who are undervalued, underappreciated. They're not playing the game right, or their look isn't right for the next project, or we have a lot of ageism in this country where we don't really respect or pay attention to our elders and their experience. They just age out, and it's like, oh, that old person. Well, they had that 40-year career where they were amazing and everything, but who needs them now? So I think we have to, I think greatness there may be more of it around than we realize. is my thought about your question, Sunil. But certainly fake personality, reality, there's a lot that's competing as well. I feel like I should be a good guest and know when the time is, not overstay my welcome. I just want to say again, a couple things. I want to again just express huge gratitude to the organizers of this. Who is my favorite actor and why? I'll get Taran's question. I can't pick a favorite for some of the reasons. It feels sort of like a violent act to me to pick one favorite because you say so many things. But everyone who comes to mind when you ask that question, and I think this is telling, is someone I've personally gotten to work with. And I say that because one of the things about working with a great artist is to have firsthand proximity to in a deep way to how they go about what they do. So right now, my favorite actor is this man, David Strathairn, with whom I've been collaborating for 5 or 6 years on this project about Jan Karski. And I do hope we'll be able to this film will be released. So people who are interested, you can see this man's work in this film. But he's my favorite actor because I got to sort of be part of a process where I watched the intensity of how he went about building this role from the inside out. So in a way, by him being my favorite, it also led me to appreciate the work of dozens of other actors and what they do to do that in a new way. But I don't have a kind of celebrity favorite in that way. There's people, so many people I admire. But I do hope the film will be called Remember This, The Lesson of Jan Karski. And I hope, that's one of the things that's great about making a film is theater is so local. And a lot of times I'm in conversations like this with people across the world, but we can't actually share each other's work unless it's through technology. And, this will allow that. I hope that you'll stay in touch. The lab is genuinely meant to be an inclusive space for everyone to have a voice and a home. The website is it's the Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics, and the website is globallab.georgetown.edu. And you can find my email on that website, and you're welcome to reach out. But I hope you'll also just sign up and get on our list so you can keep track of this work. And part of what we do, as I said, is networked to International Theater Institute and the Global Theater Initiative. So it's really meant as a way to stay in touch. And I really love it, when months or years later, I'll be at a festival halfway around the world and someone will come up and say, I saw you on this Facebook Live thing. And that's how we sort of build a relationship. So I've loved this, and I love your questions. And my one regret is not getting to kind of see your faces and hear your voices, and I hope we'll be able to do that soon. And stay strong. These are hard times. I don't know your stories and what you're grappling with, but I know that these are hard times for everybody in terms of our craft, and the questions you've asked speak to that. And I think, these are times that call for resilience, but also this kind of deep thinking about how have we gotten to where we've gotten to, and why does this work matter to us? What do we, not just to do it because we feel like we should, but what's essential. And I'll be excited to hear, some of your responses to that. Anyway, thank you so much for the time, and feel free to reach out. And thanks again so much to my friends who organized this for the opportunity to speak with you. And stay well. Bye-bye.